So welcome everybody to today's webinar, and thank you for spending your lunch hour with us if you're calling in from New Zealand. And today's webinar, Calm the Farm, is Land Planning for Permanence. And we're lucky to have two really incredible leaders in the regen ag space. Darren Doherty from the Agrarians, who's based in Australia, so who's joined us across time zones, and Shane Ward from Action Ecology, based in New Zealand. He is in Auckland at the moment, so we're sending awesome thoughts to him and everybody in Auckland right now. And I'll let them both introduce themselves shortly, but first up, we'll do a bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is going to be recorded. Anybody who's interested, it will be posted on the Calm the Farm website, and we'll be sending it out to anybody who has signed up so that you'll have it in your email if you haven't been able to attend. And the first half of the webinar is a moderated Q&A before opening it up to the audience. That's you guys. So we have about 20 minutes available for Q&A. And if we see a lot of questions coming up, I might start flicking directly to those. So please feel free to add your questions or comments to the chat at any stage. And then Carly flicks those over to me in a nice way so we keep track of which ones have been answered. So we have some incredible brains here today. So I'm hoping that you will have some fantastic questions for our panelists. So we're going to get started by learning a little bit more about you guys right now. So Darren, a lot of people know you from your whole farm planning system and the Agrarians platform. But for those who aren't familiar with your work, how would you explain the work that you do, and what's a agrarian?
Well, I don't like anyone to call themselves a agrarian as such, because I believe anyone should come up with their own definition of who they are, because I'm utterly wedded to the concept of individuals deciding their own, self-determining who they are themselves, as opposed to taking on other people's brands. So it's a convenient brand that I came up with, and it seems to work. Some people call themselves that. What it is, I suppose, if you were to identify that with yourself in that way, is someone who is using agroecological principles, which are quite broad and again self-determined, to restore, regenerate, reboot, rekindle, whatever the landscapes that you're working on, usually in some sort of transition. And that's what we ostensibly help people with, is help them through the transition from where they are, wherever that might be right now, to where they want to go, and helping them to understand perhaps ways and means that might work, and whether that's finding out what the weak links are, because sometimes that's social weak links, sometimes it's biological, sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's all of the above, and then working to find the priorities that they have right now. So that's, and we don't just work with people in agriculture. We have most of the people we do work in agricultural landscapes, but we also work with people who are, let's say, in the broader agricultural value chain. Some people are consultants working to ag, some are in retail, some are in processing, some are in logistics. So I suppose people reach out to us to help them to connect with all of that and connect the dots.
That's really interesting, because I hadn't realized that your work is that broad throughout the whole touch point on the supply chain, which of course makes sense, because nothing is isolated. Yeah,
well, and that helps as well. I mean, if you don't understand, because agriculture is the most diverse industry of any kind, well, there's nothing more diverse. And that's just on the production side of things. But when you add the whole value, well, you have to understand, in my position, I believe, you have to have a pretty good understanding of the different elements of the value chain in order to be able to help each of those pieces. When we're ecologists ultimately, and ecologists have to understand the different players in the ecology, whether that's the ecology of government, whether that's the ecology of regulation that government creates, whether that's the ecology, the ecosystem of the value chain. You have to have some understanding of that, or know who you can pass that up to or on to. So yeah,
that's fascinating. doing some digging and having conversations before, we've talked about how you used to travel the world helping land managers plan their farms at landscape scale. And, things have changed in the traveling the world sense. However, your work carries on. And in that work and understanding the deep knowledge you have both in land planning and, as you just stated, that value chain synopsis and how everybody fits in those different ecologies. Tell me a little bit about your journey to get to this level of knowledge, and who were your most influential teachers? Upon whose shoulders do you stand? Like, what was the journey like for you?
Well, there's different shoulders. I mean, you've got people who people may well recognise, those sort of innovators, those originators of various concepts, of which there's many, and some people who I haven't met and who died well before I came along. So there's all of those sorts of people, and they're the, you might say the usual suspects in this sort of space. The Yeomans, PA Yeomans, Alan Yeomans, who's still with us, and he just celebrated his 90th birthday a couple of weeks ago, and still gets up and goes to work at 7 o'clock every morning and does his thing, and still flies his planes and makes his ploughs and his carbon contraptions. And then people like Terry McCosker of RCS fame, Alan Savory of holistic management fame, Bill Mollison, who I was friends with before he passed, David Holmgren, who lives just half an hour away. He's been a friend for nearly 3 decades. So many others. So those sort of luminaries, you might say, the originators of concepts. But then the rest of it is clients. I mean, the first half of my career, which is nearly 30 years, was in doing the classic design and development. So people come to us, we'd create a design for them, some sort of master plan, and then we go off and build it. And you just interrupted me. Sorry, all of you. You just interrupted me. I'm going back and doing a bit of a retrospective where I've going back and looking at the plans that we did in the 90s, and then overlaying those plans on different properties that we developed on Google Earth. And I'm doing that as a bit of an exercise, what I'm calling a WYSIWYG exercise. What you see is what you get. And but anyway, a lot of those people that we worked with back all through that period, we learned an enormous amount from them, because a lot of them were business people. Agriculture and land management is not monolithic in that it's not just people who are, you might say, professional farmers. It's made up, that only makes up in most Western societies about a third of the actual practitioner or land manager cadre. It's made up of business people, it's made up of lifestylers, it's made up of people who have another identity outside of being a professional land manager. And some of them dance both worlds, as people do and are capable of doing. So we've learned an enormous amount. In fact, I'd say much more from those people than we have from the luminaries. And then there's the landscape itself. I mean, the landscape itself, the systems that you work with, if you're paying attention, which I speak to all the time, if you've got your eyes wide open and you go to landscapes with all of your senses alive, well then it's the greatest teacher of all. And we don't just stand on the earth's shoulders, we stand on it. And that's I suppose that's what I've got there.
Awesome. Now, thinking about what the land can teach you and how place and understanding how to observe is such an important integral part of everything that you do. Can you speak a little bit about how Indigenous knowledge has informed or influenced helping you understand how to observe or work with the landscapes?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've had various, I've worked with a whole wide range of Indigenous or First Nations people around the world. In Aotearoa, that's been some of my most powerful work when I worked down at the Parihakapa near Taranaki with Griffin Hope. I think that was in about 2006. And that was profound. I mean, that was a really great experience. We stayed in the marae you were immediately inculcated, invited into an ancient culture that still exists, and that was very powerful. And with that that whole PA's history of non-violent protest, winning the Martin Luther King Award, all that sort of stuff. I mean, they were precursors to a lot of to the non-violent protest movements that we have now. But then, what's rooted behind that is this whole lineage of practice, which took me to Taiwan in, I think about 2009 or something. I was working there in the village of the Rukai people, who are reputed as being where the Polynesians, where the Polynesian diaspora started, and looking at all of their traditions and connecting all of that and seeing I've worked a lot across Polynesia in Hawaii and elsewhere. So that's been really fascinating, seeing that ethnicity, if you like, carry out, and the collective traditions. But then here in Australia, of course, with the various First Nations that we have here, over 360, as I understand it, we've worked with a lot of those. And this whole concept of time that Europeans have. Because Europeans are always looking at the clock, just like I was 1 minute before we started, trying to cram it all in. We have a way of doing things, and so it's really refreshing to learn from that. And then I've worked with people in Native Americans as well, both in Canada and Central, across the Americas. Most people think of America as the United States of America, but most Americans get offended by that. Even calling the United States when Mexico's name is Estados Unidos y Mexico, so United States of Mexico. So working with people across there in South America and so on, and even into Africa, and some of the indigenous people who still maintain language in Europe and Eurasia. There's a common thing about connectedness to landscape. And I won't say that, because Christianity or Judeo-Christian concepts of dominion, speaking to you in the Dominion of New Zealand, that carries through. So, when you take on that whole story and you're trying to meld that with your old story, that plays into some pretty interesting stuff in terms of contemporary expressions, both in terms of landscape management, in terms of cultural output. So it's been just fascinating. I get fascinated by the interaction that people have with landscapes and ecology, and whoever they are, because that's always the first step. Understanding people's context. And so everyone's got a story which brings them back to that. And, some of the constellation thinking that goes around that really feeds into that itself being a Zulu derived practice that Westerners now do. All of that stuff really builds in. And so there's no single influence. It's just meeting with people where they are, and understanding and respecting and contextualizing their story and what the story of the land is at that time as well, because that's a really big part of what we're trying to do, connecting contexts.
So then, thinking of the story of that land and the worldview that we sit in often as Westerners or as Western farmers and land managers, how do you see the interplay of landscape planning and regenerative farming fitting together?
Well, the whole regenerative thing is a fairly amorphous description anyway. No one's really, there's no official definition of what that means, you might say, because it was coined, the term regenerative agriculture or regenerative organic agriculture was coined by Robert Rodale in the 80s. And it's sort of laid languid for a while with the Rodale Institute, and then, you know, thanks to the agency of people like myself, going around the world and picking up on that brand and turning it into a brand, as I did with when I originated the term regen ag in 2008-9. You know, that really helped to launch that and take it from being something that was in the background to where it is now. And so there's a whole suite of definitions that go with that now. And it's, yeah, like I said, it's a bit amorphous to sort of put a finger on. But to the question, it's, what we're trying to do, well, in my context, is just say, all right, well, and that's why I like agroecology as a term, because I just think it just says, you know, if you've got agriculture, even if you're doing it badly, whatever that means, is still a practice of ecology. There's still plants involved. There's still, you know, perhaps animals involved, and in spite of your worst efforts, there's still probably microbial life in the soil involved, right? And that's where it starts. And you're either trying to work with that, or you're trying to suppress or repress organisms within that. You're trying to be in control. So for me, it's about, first off, giving people the understanding of the role that ecology plays in your work. And that extends, of course, out to social ecologies and financial ecologies and all of that as well. But, you know, if you just focus on the living ecologies of a landscape, and how you fit in with that, and how happy are you, or how equipped are you to give up on the variables that agriculture has been so successful in quelling. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we are where we are with the population we're able to support and so on, is because we've decreased variables to a point where we can create this extremely reliable food chain. Now, it might be shit food half the time, but we can do it. We do it. And we're able to support billions more people as a result. So, you know, are you happy with being in that level of control? And what are the external factors that are being disrupted as a result of that level of control? Which takes us back to this whole European notion.
I was going to say, it's reminding me of the Dominion statement you were saying previously.
Exactly.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. So, you know, we just try, like, again, just try and meet people where they are, because everyone's at a different stage, and every landscape's at a different stage. And there's a lot of species that are missing, right? There's a lot of bugs that are missing, right? That's no accident. That's not necessarily been, you know, I don't think that people, when they developed agricultural, novel chemistry for agriculture, had the intent of wiping out the world's insect populations, or causing mass extinction events, but it's happened.
And yet here we are.
Here we are. So, you know, where do we come back from that? You know, how do we come back from that? And that's what I mean. Sometimes you just got to, when you talk about regeneration, sometimes it actually starts with just rekindling, right? You got to rekindle your notions of who you are and what your relationships are with this world.
Yeah, and I like the framing of that, you know, with the complexity of regenerative farming, when we think of it in terms of agroecology, and what is the ecology on the place where you are managing landscapes, they're working landscapes, and to start in that kind of framing is, it's an interesting trajectory.
Well, you still got to make a buck, and, you know, you still got to function in this world. So, you know, it's, as they say, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, you know. Yeah,
awesome. So Shane, I'd love to hear about yourself and your journey to where you are now, because I know that you lean some parts with the work that you do on the trajectory that Darren has come from as well. But I'd love to hear about your journey, and who do you feel you owe the most to in teaching you what you know, or pointing you in the right direction?
Sure. Well, Darren's made a lot of really good points there. And one of the things that actually really stood out for me was this really important point about stories and people and landscape and that story that we tell ourselves, tell each other. And so I suppose, from my story, so I'm an agroecologist and regenerative land use advisor. I'm not originally from New Zealand. I grew up in a mud brick house on a small bush block on the outskirts of Melbourne in an expat French family. I grew up there a bit in France before moving to Europe in my 20s. And I had previous careers in film and television and corporate communications, working in like banking, finance, property and energy sectors before kind of finding my way back to the natural world. So this idea of story to me has actually been one that's been throughout my entire adult life, really, either telling them, finding them, helping shape them. And I guess I came into this space, like Darren, originally through permaculture design. And then after doing that for a while, I was hungry to learn more and to really understand, all this stuff. And so I furthered my training through agroforestry and soil ecology, and did my degree at university, a science degree on ecology, plant and geographical sciences. And then, of course, the agrarians program, which really was super useful for me, weaving it all together into something coherent that I could actually use to help clients. So in terms of who have I learned the most from? I've learned from so many people along the way. No one person has a monopoly on the truth, and everyone's got something to teach. So it's hard to say, but I suppose some of the major paradigm shifts for me along the way have probably come from people like Bill Mollison and Elaine Ingham, in terms of a lens for looking at things and seeing things as a system. And then there's been loads of people along the way, and of course, like Darren says, actual experience and conversations, in all kinds of sectors, have all been really important. But I think also, like going back to Darren's agrarians framework, that scale of permanence idea that's sort of that holds that together, I think has been really helpful for me in practical terms and applying the knowledge that I've got in the sort of design and advisory work that I do day to day. So, that's been really, really important.
That's interesting, because I remember one of the first conversations that we had when we first met. I asked you about, your practice and what you do, and you were like, really, all I do is take everything I've learned from everyone else and apply it to the context that I see in front of me, or that works for the landscape that I have. So I really appreciate the non-dogmatic approach of, there's so much learning out there and so much information and so many ways of approaching a situation, and it's all about what is most contextually relevant at the time. No, it's awesome.
It's key. Like Darren was saying, it's all about context. And one of the interesting things about doing this kind of work, which I'm sure Darren can attest to as well, is that so much of it is about the psychology that's necessary to know how to work with lots of different people, to really kind of put yourself in their shoes as much as possible and understand where they're at, what is the context for their landscape, their family, their business, everything that they're doing, so that you can really help make sure that they're connecting with the right kind of knowledge that's actually going to be useful to them.
Yeah, awesome. So I'd love to hear, Shane, about the people who you work with, the land managers you work with. Who are they? Are they all farmers? Are they different kinds of land managers, to Darren's point? What are the common things that make them begin to be curious about even calling you or making a change? And then I've got other questions after.
I suppose, I work with people from, people who are managing the landscape every day, to people working in government and everything in between. As I kind of alluded to, my focus is really about trying to connect people with the science and practice of agroecological regenerative land use. Because there are so many useful things to draw from. And so I kind of, hopefully act like a useful funnel and an enabler, like a facilitator almost. So a lot of them are farmers, absolutely, but certainly not all of them. In terms of what sets people down this path to calling me, I guess it's obviously different for everyone, but I think it usually starts with noticing a problem, or there'll be something which doesn't compute often. They may hear of someone doing something else and think, oh, that's really interesting. And suddenly it sort of creates a space for them to become curious. I think the thing that I really enjoy most about it and what I do, helping people make connections. I really love helping people see the landscape for what it is, which is a biological system, And to me, that's the start of them writing a new story for their relationship to the land, which I find really energizing. And so that light bulb moment to me is always about connection. It's usually often comes about once they start to kind of clue into this sort of all these hidden interactions, which they maybe weren't taught about or hadn't seen with their eyes between microbes and plants and water and landscape. And when they start to be able to piece that story together of what's kind of going on in the landscape, it really starts to come alive.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious too how you might manage, or if you run into, I've noted people and farmers, and particularly my father in really particular, when there's an issue on the landscape, you're often seeing a problem and then looking for a solution. What do I do? Is the question that I hear a lot. And of course, in this space, often the answer is, well, it depends, because it depends on what are you trying to achieve? What is the lens? And so I'd love to hear about what makes the light bulb go on for people you've worked with to move away from the what do I do to learning the larger body of work. And then is there anything that's missing to help people move to that place or to move from education to action?
So the first part is, it's usually a conversation that's about trying to move from symptoms to root causes. For sure, you might think you might have a problem, in your field or whatever it is, and we can solve it. But usually, land managers, they're not stupid. They're pretty quick to work out that if it's going to happen again, they can pay to fix it. But if they're going to have to pay to fix it again next year, then that's not really ideal. So let's have a think about why it might be happening in the first place. And is there an opportunity to maybe do something? It can even just be a small tweak sometimes, which could have other benefits, but then prevents this from occurring in the first place. So to me, that's, always trying to find these sort of win-wins or these kind of, I suppose, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren would sort of say, find the smallest change you can make that's going to have the greatest beneficial effect. So to me, I'm always looking for ways to try and have that conversation, I guess. And you got to meet people where they're at and what their focus is. But that's hopefully where we're going. In terms of common barriers, I don't think there's anything that's really missing, right? In terms of, there's nothing preventing people from kind of moving in this direction. Really, the only requirement is kind of intellectual curiosity and the psychological safety to give it a go. But in terms of, there's things that could be improved in the world to make it easier, for sure, incentivized even. But most of the barriers I've tended to find are cultural and economic. They're not ecological. The problem isn't like what the land can do or what the biology can do. We're still learning so much about that all the time. And that's really exciting. But the limits I tend to find aren't what is possible on the land. It's more what is practical and how do we navigate a path towards that.
That's interesting. Darren, Shane alluded to the scales of permanence that you work with in the Regrarians framework. Can you speak a little bit about that for those who aren't, used to that or don't understand it? Because I think it's a big part of all of the work that you both do.
Yeah, well, I've probably drifted a bit away from because, just to go back, the Keyline scale of relative permanence, just for people who may be listening, was first framed in P.A. Yeoman's book, The Challenge of Landscape, the Development and Practice of Keyline in 1958, which I think is my favourite of his 4 books. And it was this scale of relative permanence where someone who was let's say a nascent land planner was still trying, and his whole Keyline framework by 1958 was still, well, as David Holmgren, the co-originator of permaculture, put it, he said, the Keyline plan was the first broadacre landscape planning framework that anyone had ever developed. Up to that point, lots of people had come up with lots of techniques and technical bits, but they never really pulled it together. And Yeomans was largely working by himself and with his young sons, and to an extent also with J. MacDonald Holmes, who was at that time the Dean of Geography at the University of Sydney. He was a really big ally of Yeomans and had been for about 15 years up to that point. J. McDonald Holmes, as an aside, he wrote the first book called Soil Conservation for Australia and New Zealand in 1946. So he brought the whole soil conservation concept from the United States to Australia and to a lesser extent New Zealand. But that's the book he wrote. So that's all tied together. And I think it's important to contextualise that. Well, I think it is always important to contextualise the lineage of information that leads to people originating concepts or frameworks, because it again is the context, you know, where are people getting their ideas, who are they talking to, and so on. So when Yeomans released that, that was still a fairly nascent idea. And really, when you go through the rest of his writings, which more or less finished by about the mid-70s, because he died in 84, he didn't really embed the Keyline scale of relative permanence into his work. It didn't seem very prominent. And even for someone like myself, I started teaching Keyline as such and used, you said before, permaculture was probably my first reference. No, it wasn't. It was Keyline, because I grew up on a property that was influenced by Keyline and so on. So permaculture just seemed a bit more cool and the next sort of iteration of something that was developed from Keyline, because both Yeomans and Holmgren were heavily influenced by Yeomans, and why wouldn't you be? So what I found was that I sort of overlooked the scale of permanence to an extent in the way that I was planning places, because I was thinking of it more through, maybe the permaculture lens and so on. It wasn't really until 2011 that the light bulb, even after nearly 2 decades of working with Keyline, that the light bulb came out that, hey, here's actually a process. Because, when you were asking before about, this it depends thing that people always seem to give to sort of bypass being out, to being safe about giving advice, it's sort of like, oh, I can't give you advice because it depends too much, which I'll park for a minute. But I just lacked that process. And when the light bulb came in, I said, here it is. It's been, sitting here in front of me all this time. That was when things really changed for me in terms of there being an actual logical process. But the big problem with Yeoman's scale of permanence was it didn't recognise context, because, and it still doesn't. And that's why when we when we looked at the scale of permanence and then went, okay, it's a good frame, but it was really, and as he called it, it was the Keyline scale of permanence of things agricultural. That's what the full official term was, right? So it was really just about agricultural factors, if you like, just the physical factors of agriculture and the physical factors that influence agriculture. So the climate is the meteorological factors and how you manage the climate of the soil. Landscape is a physical landscape. Farm dams, because Yeomans was big about building dams, right? And all that supported that. Farm roads, right? So there's all of these factors, and that's how he called them. They were factors. So whereas when you take a fresh look at this in the more, because I think that where we, Savory's insights in drawing Smuts, Johan Smuts' insights into holism, that just opened the whole thing up, because it said, it's not just about agricultural factors here anymore. It's social factors, it's financial factors, and so on. So that's when we started to reframe it all together. And then in using it over the last nearly 10 years, over the last few years, I've sort of gone, well, it's really about layers. That's the way I describe it now. It's not about, so because there is so much going on and everything is so contextualized, you can't just say that water, you have, when you're designing a farm, that the water layer has a higher importance necessarily than a fencing layer or a tree layer, because that completely depends on so many factors, right? So I kind of look at it as being more of a clearinghouse of layers, because when you're a planner, you work in layers, right?
Yeah.
And what the scope of those layers is a whole other discussion, right? And that's what we're trying to do here. We're just trying to give people a framework of what the scope of the layers that they're working with, and then try and tie that together. And if where they're at right now, especially with graziers, who we find ourselves working with a lot, it's the water and fencing layers that they've got to, that is going to shift them to where they want to go, right? Mm-hmm. So, and we don't just say, oh, here's the water and the fencing has to follow. The two actually have to work very much in concert. One doesn't dominate the other, I suppose. So that's where I've sort of got to with this. So I've sort of, I respect and I understand the concept of scales of permanence, but where I've personally got to, and is to look at, the framework that we've based on or adapted from as being of its time, and that we've kind of moved on, and that we're ecologists, so we've got to respond as ecologists, which is situational.
So they are all things to consider in the greater whole of the many things that make up a farming context, including family, finance, social, all of those things.
And that's so much of what we're doing is, where do you start? What are your priorities? So when we go this whole "it depends" thing, we don't do that anymore. I draw on what Graham Hand, who's a friend and a mentor, he says, do practice areas, right? So so if you've got something that you want to try, well, it's not it depends. Let's have a crack at doing something on a 1% trial, right? It's safe, as he puts it, it's safe to fail.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Do that, and then you can get your progress from there. So that's the way we proceed.
Interesting. So Shane, I'd love for you to take me through. I'm Farmer Aaron. I've called you in. I'm a grazier, and you're going to come to my farm and take a look around. So what are some questions that you're asking me before you come over, and what are you taking a look at, or what are we discussing when you're at my property?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I'm going to be doing is, whether it's remotely on the phone or Zoom or, however, really want to try and understand the context. Who are you? What are you doing? What's your situation now? Where are you finding difficulty or challenge, in the current situation, or where are you looking towards in the future? What's this, is succession, intergenerational succession something you're thinking about? Are you having trouble with drought, or, what is it? Really trying to build a good picture of that, because that really does affect then what direction we're going to be taking things in. And then, and of course, during this, I'm trying to understand as well what the appetite is for change, and the level of economic or social flexibility they may have to undertake that, and what their sort of appetite is for stuff. And then if all that sort of stuff makes sense and it's a good fit and whatever, and we want to continue, then yeah, absolutely, we'll go and we'll do a walk around. And that to me is where a lot of it really comes out as well. What people will say officially, in a kind of formal or even informal just conversation is, I always find just very different from what, or at least it is a different slice of the pie than you get when you actually start walking the land with people. And the stories start to come out. Oh, that over there, my grandpa, built that, and and just you start to get the story of the landscape and the story of the people, and the history of our land use is written on the landscape, and so that is such a critical part of it. And I am looking and obviously taking my own information away from that and learning myself, but I'm also really keen to hear what their perspective is on it. The things the way that they look at it. And there's lots of stuff. And sometimes I know I can be valuable by pointing things out, which they have become sort of, blind to, it's just they're so used to it, it's just passed into the background, they don't even notice. But that process of asking questions is super valuable. And so really it's exactly what the specific questions are will depend a bit on the person and the place and everything. But that's what I'm trying to get to through that process.
It's interesting. So as you know, I'm a holistic management educator as well, and I remember in our training specifically talking about those farmers who don't want to talk about context or can't set their holistic goal in the way that you might intend. You will pick it up in the conversation because people speak their values in all the conversations that you have. And so being able to pick that up is so incredibly important. I was also hearing you say, you were talking about succession as an issue that you might be hearing when you're walking landscape with people, which is, with huge land transfers happening around the world right now, aging farming populations, this is a very, very big topic that often is a little bit crunchy for some people to dig into. Can you talk me through how planning landscape might ease through a plan for succession as well?
Well, I mean, I'm not someone who's involved, obviously, in the conversations that they're having with their family about this stuff. But from my perspective, I think that the kind of work that I'm doing, or just this sort of thinking in the first place, I think is a really critical and maybe overlooked part of just wider farm planning, at least in New Zealand at the moment. I think that so the relationship between the sort of design and planning part and the management is something that we should be having more conversations about more often, I think. I mean, it's a webinar all to itself. But, I think that the whole point of asking questions around what we're doing, not just how we're doing it, is really important. They're both important, but I think you need to have both. In terms of the succession planning thing, I mean, I think there's an inherent opportunity in this kind of design and planning focus, particularly, when you're taking an agroecological regenerative lens to things, because, I think what it does is it allows a space for people to really engage with what future generations might be facing, what you might be passing on to them, and asking questions about the what sort of land use patterns are we doing here? What patterns should we be doing here? What could we possibly be building towards? How can we? And I think, every single land manager I've ever spoken to wants to leave their land in a better state than they found it, without doubt. So to me, that's a great place to start having a conversation of what that could look like, and perhaps just pushing aside some of the boundaries of where they think that conversation could end. It doesn't have to be dairy or sheep and beef or avocados or whatever, or forestry. It can be a mix. So, how do we make sure that, or how do we at least work towards it being a place that's regenerating, not degrading over time? How can we make that future an exciting one, not just a pile of debt that's actually something that'll draw future generations to want to be a part of that?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And Darren, I'd love to ask you the same question, working with farmers everywhere and understanding the current reality that we're in of land ownership and seeing so much transfer about to be happening. How do you see planning landscapes fitting into becoming good ancestors and easing succession?
Yeah, you have to, again, well, I suppose I look back in the first part of my career, because I like I said before, I kind of look at this in two parts, because the first half, I exerted dominion as a planner through the creation of master plans. And then the second half of my career is being, hey, you plan your farm. It's not my job, it's for you, which lets me off the hook. So if something goes wrong, well, then it's your problem. Part of which like I said before, I'm able to do through the revision that is the naked earth of Google Earth. I know the places that I've worked on, and it's interesting to go back and see what's going on there. But look, when you're looking at, like, succession is a very dear topic to me, because of we lost our own family farm. I was the next one in line, and it didn't happen, and I'm not there. And that will be something that I take to my grave as being probably one of the most powerful things in my life, in that defines your life. And that really ties in, all of the indigenous people or First Nations people who've been dispossessed. I mean, you know, we had a 5-generation connection to that property, not hundreds or if not thousands of generations. So it's yeah. So I have, you know, a pumpteenth of the empathy there. And, you know, when we look at succession, well, succession is built around, again, a European notion of property. And it gets down sometimes to, like, I'm doing one for an old friend at the moment where I'm working with them, and their property they've had for 4 generations. It's not that big. I think it's about 150 acres. It was once a productive unit at that size, right? But with the changing terms of trade and so on, it's changed. And now it's going to be, they've got to a point where it's about to be carved up into 3 different lots. They're going to remain contiguous. But then when you look at how are you going to play with the layout of that place, well, there's going to be a fence line where there was a fence line not before. And that's the first step, you might say, to that further diminution of that landscape's possibility to be a productive agricultural unit in today's economic context. And then it goes on from there. And that's what I just shake inside when I hear people looking at that. And I try and, you know, again, it's their choice, right? People can make their own choices, but I try and impart on them the stories. The other thing that's happened, I remember having this guy, he was never a client, but he used to just ring me up all the time. I've had a few of them over the journey. You know, oh, he's that Keyline guy, I'll call him up, right? Anyway, he rang me up. He was in Western Australia, and it got to the point where, like, he was talking to me about how bad things were. He had about 6,000 hectares, so it was a pretty big bit of land in the southwest. And he said to me, you know where we've got to? He said, in the last 2 succession events, in the last 3 succession events, we've had someone in our families had to buy the farm again. And I went, wow. And so what's happened then in that period, in those periods of succession, agricultural terms of trade have changed. And so how I define that is the differential between the farm gate price and the retail price, right? As one metric of that. So that's got wider, right? And then the other thing that's happened is agricultural land prices have just gone crazy, right? So the production value that you can obtain from a landscape and the landscape value are completely off the scale. So if you want to, so where we've got to now is really, and I started talking about this years ago, was this return of baronial feudalism, because what we've gone is full circle. You know, the new world was defined by people who were escaping all of that, right? They were the colonials. They were escaping the you know, being serfs, peasants, etc., feudalism. We've come back out full circle, and capitalism, or however you want to put it, just this disparity between terms of trade and agricultural land values have meant that there's been a wholesale consolidation of land. And so you have a lot more people now who are leasing land because it's the only way to make a buck. And unless you're an extraordinarily fiscally disciplined, and you're able to work in landscapes really, really well, then your capacity to own a significant and viable piece of land starting from scratch nowadays is really, really difficult. And so the great colonial dream is kind of over from that perspective, unless you get landed something. So it's a really tough one. And so we have a lot of conversations with a lot of people. In the United States, it's a big conversation as well because they have inheritance taxes. And it's not hard for your property to be worth more than $5 million. I mean, how many properties in New Zealand are worth $5 million, right? That are productive. So the way it works there is that when you transfer from one generation to the next, it's 50% of every dollar over 5 million that you owe the government when your parent dies, when that transfer occurs, right? So that's a major impost. And so we have to develop all sorts of bloody fandangled structures and pathways to overcome that toll. You know, people go, oh, gee, it's $5 million. That's not, you've got no idea. It's not like they're sitting, you know, it's the old, you know, land, cash poor, land rich sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it's a very complex thing. A lot of people don't talk about it because, you know, a lot of people don't worry about their, you know, this whole, oh, the doctor says you're about to die, you better get your affairs in order. Those affairs should have been in order 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? The best, and as I say to people, the best time to have a conversation with your children about succession is when they're in utero, right? You can't start early enough. If you have children, you're in the succession business, right? So you better get things sorted, because if you don't build a culture of that conversation into your relationships as a family, then, you know, the longer you leave that, the worse it's going to get. And then people get weird when succession happens if things aren't organised. They get really weird, right?
Yeah.
And shit hits the fan. It's not a good story. So
great advice, which is start the conversation early, keep it open, and make sure that any of that, and any of those, I'll be sure to give that advice to friends of mine who are having babies, and make sure that any land planning.
You sit there rubbing your belly, going, none of this will be yours, right?
And to your point, though, making sure that any of the land planning that happens is happening in conversation with any people who might be staying with that landscape.
So there's a conversation in this space around, you know, just because you were born out of the right vagina doesn't necessarily mean that you are the ideal person to take on that landscape. And so, you know, there's a notion that there is a frame in this, that's a conversation where people are saying, all right, the land is actually more important than the people, right? And the people pass through and do their thing, but the land gets influenced by that. And sometimes when some people pass through, they don't actually do the right thing. And if their greatest contextual influence on their life is debt, and a poor debt to equity ratio, then it's usual the land will suffer, because the natural capital, any natural capital that's been built up in the land will often be exploited just to survive, just to financially survive. And that's not a good situation. So sometimes, and it's a hard one, but you know, and when I have this conversation with people, I put this all on the table, because it's all about, people want to know what the scenarios are. What are the ways that you can proceed? And I've got any number of different examples of really good examples of where people have really cracked this nut, and even more examples where it's just a complete miasma.
Yeah. And Shane, I have a quick question to ask you, but just really, really briefly, just wanted to mention that, like, in what I've noted on the Rex program that you have and the Reverians platform that you work with, so much of the work that you do, Darren, appears to be bringing people together to have those conversations, to collaborate for solutions, to keep having those discussions, because it is in each other's knowledge that we find answers that might be more relevant to our situations. So I'm really glad to hear that you're open to talking about succession so early. And I think it's in those networks, as we start to talk about things, these really hard things, more openly, that we will come to different ways of being in it, including, like you just said, it's the land that remains, and it's the land that maintains its provenance throughout all of the people who pass through it. So how can we be the best ancestors for that process?
Well, Rochelle's just put a point about that males, I mean, I'm completely with you. The whole gender role tradition thing. I mean, that's old news, right? So yeah, that's old practice. We're well beyond that. And that's, I think, to the point. Who is the best person, the best individual, regardless of gender, that is going to be the person or people. what are the structures that support that? I mean, when I talk about that, what corporate structures, trusts, companies, holding companies, etc. There's all of these different frameworks around that. So yeah, and we are beyond it, but our culture isn't. Well, that's just the moment in time we're in. That's why you've got to have the conversation. The best time to have the conversation is now. We hosted Joel Salatin and his son Daniel and his daughter-in-law Sherry on what was called a Fields of Farmers tour, and it was primarily about farm succession, because they have got it pretty well sorted, and we put them on a talking show around Australia in 2015. It was a really successful series, and so often what happened was that it caused all of these cultural crossing points, because, like Rochelle has pointed out, it may not be that it's the patrilinear pathway that is the one that's that goes on here. And so we had a lot of people who rang us up later and said, a female and her father, we had about 4 of them actually, who called up and said, I had a 2-hour screaming match with my father the whole drive home from your workshop. And we haven't spoken to each other for a month or something like that. But now we've sort of come back because that person, that child, the child of that father is the land manager. They're the best equipped to do it. And they come up against this patriarchy and all of those notions. That's just old news. And so, yeah, it is we're not beyond it. I completely agree with Rochelle. We're not beyond it, but that's not to mean, as my wife says, life is full of uncomfortable conversations, and a lot of people skirt around them. Yeah. And if your whole life is defined by agreeableness, well, then don't be surprised if you get rolled over. It's just, that's just the way it is. Sometimes you've got to be disagreeable. And if you can't get your way, or it doesn't work for you, well, then maybe you need to move on somewhere else, because it will bring you down. Who needs that?
Yeah. And Shane, I know that you just spent quite a bit of time going all around New Zealand, interviewing, chatting with different regenerative farmers. And I'm really curious about some great takeaways that you've had from those experiences, and thinking about these topics that we've talked about today. Where have you all been, and where were your best learnings on this trip?
Right. Well, I mean, I'll keep it brief. I mean, yeah. So I rode my motorcycle all around the country, and up and down from Southland to Northland. And I mean, the key takeaways overall, it was, for me, it was hugely positive. It was a hugely positive story that I kind of walked away with, having met all these fantastic farmers and managers. Just the sort of the innovation was a key sort of theme that came out of it. Just every single one of them, I think, that I spoke to had kind of realized and gone through this process of realizing that they're not actually farmers, they're ecosystem managers. I think they were all really brave, in their own way. They've all could have done it despite the sort of prevailing industry, not because of it, without its support. In fact, in some cases, almost a bit of hostility in some quarters. But, they've nevertheless done it anyway, and they've done it really well. I think that, I was also struck that they were all really motivated. They were all positive about the future and excited about what they were doing. They literally all said to me, I think, some version of, I get up out of bed every morning excited about walking out there. And that to me is the biggest testament of all. Again, it was highly contextual. It was actually great to just see all the different permutations of how this kind of looks in these different landscapes, different families, et cetera, et cetera. But again, there were these common themes. It sort of reinforced for me, I think, one of the things that I had plenty of time riding the motorbike by myself to sort of stew on this stuff. And one of the things was, really just, it distilled for me this idea of what actually makes a productive system, regenerative. Whether you are milking cows in South Otago or you're growing bananas in a syntropic agroforestry system in Northland, there is something that they're doing the same thing in essence. And that was really sort of great to see that in action playing out on the land. the thing which sort of struck me as well was that they're actually all a bit isolated. And I think this is probably true largely for almost all of the pioneers in this space, in the sense that they've all had to do it more or less by themselves, alone, independently. And there may be some knowledge sharing, or they might be sort of learning from each other, across the globe, which is great. But it's not with the help of an industry. They are having to very much swim against the current. And so there isn't necessarily the recognition or the reward for their efforts that maybe there could be. So I think, therefore, there is a huge opportunity. And I think it's one of the things that I'm very sort of excited about. And I know that, Toha and Calm the Farm also operating in this space to sort of find how can we work together, and really not expect every pioneer to not only be an amazing land manager and be constantly learning, but also be great at marketing and websites and understanding, short chain supply and logistics and packing and handling and all this other stuff. It's, so much. So to me, there's this great opportunity for all of us to actually kind of get what we all want. We're all stakeholders in the food system, right? And everyone. And so the idea of finding these opportunities for mutual benefit and helping each other is huge, and we can start with where we are today. We can look at it from a more sort of drive production economic standpoint, in terms of starting to get more on the dollar and, but nevertheless, I think being able to integrate farm systems more, do some work with shortening those food chains, getting people to actually buy closer to farm gate. There's an export story there for farmers in New Zealand. There's a lot of environmental good that can come out of it. But farm resilience, I think, is going to be the single biggest metric that's going to matter in the next 30 years. And so there's a really good story for that there too. So
yeah, as we're about to blow past 1.5 degrees, we need to be having larger conversations about how we can all work together to maintain resilience through everything that is going to be coming in the future. So we are at time. The two of you have just been fantastic fountains of knowledge. I appreciate your time so much. I'm also going to be asking you to send to us your favorite podcasts and reads and listens, because we keep a library going for anybody who's on Calm the Farm to see what is everybody listening to right now. So thank you so much for joining us today. Remembering that this is recorded, it'll be sent out to everyone. Thank you so much for the questions, everybody from the audience, and for your time, Darren and Shane. You are absolute legends.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for the opportunity. Great to see you both.
It was fantastic.
And
cheers.
Thanks for everyone for joining us. All the best. Sláinte.